Hello everybody, welcome to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes out of Central Europe, and this is a story that was collected by the Grimm's brothers, and it is the story of the Frog Prince. Once long ago there was a king, and this king had several sons and many daughters, and they were all very, very nice to look on. But the most beautiful of all was his youngest daughter, and she was so beautiful that even the sun lingered in the sky just to look on her. Well, near to the palace where the king and his family lived, there was a very dark wood, and in the woods, underneath a linden tree, there was a well. And the youngest princess, she liked to go into those woods and to sit down near the well, and she had a little golden ball that was her favorite toy. And she would take that ball and she would throw it up in the air and she would catch it. And she would throw it up in the air and she would catch it. And that was her favorite game to play. Every single day she played that game. She would throw the ball up in the air and she would catch it. And she would do it all the time. But one day, she threw the ball up in the air and she missed it. Now, she had missed it before, but usually when she missed catching the ball, it just landed on the ground. But this time, it fell into the well. And the princess made a grab for it quickly, but she missed, and it fell down, 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 down through the water, so far down that she couldn't see it anymore. It was just gone. Well, it was her favorite toy, and she really wanted it back, but she really wasn't sure how to get it back. And she began to cry. She was so upset. And she cried and she cried because she had lost her ball. And while she was crying, suddenly she heard a voice say, "Princess, princess, why are you crying? Your tears would melt a heart of stone." And the princess looked around. She couldn't see anyone at first. And then she realized there was a frog whose ugly little head was sticking out of the water in the well. And she looked at him and she said, Oh, little waddler, well, I'm crying because I had a golden ball and I was playing with it and I didn't catch it and it fell in the well and now I've lost it." And the frog said, "I can get your ball back for you. If I were to get your ball back for you, what would you give me in return?" Well, the princess thought. She said, "You could have any of my dresses or my jewelry or even my crown. I would give you anything if you would give me my ball back." And the frog said, "I do not want your dresses or your jewelry or your crown. What I would like is if you would take me to live with you in the palace and let me eat off of your golden plate and sleep in your silken bed with you and have me be your playmate and your companion." "All right," said the princess, because she really wanted her ball back. And as soon as she said that, the frog turned around and dove under the water and disappeared. But the princess was thinking in her head, "It's a silly frog, as if he would ever leave the well. He couldn't live in the palace. There's no pools and ponds inside the palace. He's so silly." So when the frog came up out of the water with the ball in his mouth and dropped it onto the ground, the princess snatched up her golden ball and she ran back to the palace, so very happy to have her ball back. And even though the frog called after her, Wait, princess, I can't hop as fast as you can run," she kept on running and she ignored him. And she ran back to the palace with her golden ball, and she went back inside the palace, and pretty soon she forgot all about the frog. Well, the next day, The king and his whole family and all of the court were sitting down to have a grand feast at the table. And as they were just beginning the feast, there came a great sound of someone on the steps, coming upside the steps outside, and then a knocking on the door. And then a voice was heard calling out, "King's youngest daughter, King's youngest daughter, please let me in." Well, the youngest princess was quite surprised by this, for she had forgotten all about the frog by this time, but she went to see who was at the door. And when she opened the door and saw just the ugly old frog, she closed the door quickly again and went back into the feast. But her father could see that something was bothering her. And so he asked her, he said, "Honey, who was at the door? Was it a giant come to take you away? You look rather alarmed." And she said, "No, father, it was an ugly old frog. You see, yesterday when I was out by the well, I threw my ball up in the air and I missed it when it came back down, and it landed in the well and it went all the way down and I couldn't see it anymore, and I started crying, and the frog came out and he offered to get my ball for me as long as I would bring him back to live in the palace with me, but I never thought he would actually leave the well, father, or I would never have made such a promise." And her father said to her, "It does not matter what you thought when you made the promise, my dear. You promised, and a princess always keeps her promises. Go back to the door and let the frog in." Well, she was not very happy, but she went back to the door and she opened it up, and the frog hopped inside. And then the princess closed the door and she went back to the feast, and the frog hopped along behind her. And when he got to the table, he said, "Lift me up, princess, so that I may share the food off of your plate." And the princess lifted him up and put him on a chair, but from there he couldn't reach her plate. And so she had to pick him up and put him on the table where everyone in the court could see the ugly frog that was eating off of her plate with her. And she had to push her plate over a little bit so that the frog could reach it. And the frog made a grand feast, for he had not had food like that in quite some time. But the princess, every bite she took just felt like it got stuck in her throat. She was so embarrassed to have this ugly frog sitting next to her and eating off of her plate, and oh, it was horrid. Well, eventually the feast was over, and the frog said, "I'm quite full, and actually I'm rather sleepy. Princess, is it time for us to go to bed now? I would like to sleep in your silken bed with you." Well, the princess was not happy to hear that this frog actually thought he was going to sleep in her bed. Cold and slimy frog was going to sleep in her bed with her? Ew! And so she delayed getting up and leaving the table as long as she possibly could. But her father heard the frog talking to her, and he said to her, "Daughter, you made a promise, and princesses always keep their promises. It is time for you to go to bed, and you must take the frog with you." Well, she was not very happy about that, but she had to obey her father, the king. And so she picked up the frog, and she carried him up to her bedroom, and she dropped him in a dark corner. And then she went and she got ready for bed, and she climbed into her bed with its silken bed sheets. And as she lay there in the dark, suddenly she heard a flip-flop sound on the floor. And then she heard a voice say, "Princess, I am tired and I would like to sleep in your soft silken bed with you. If you don't let me in, I will go tell your father." Well, the princess was tired, and she was cranky, and she was hungry, and she was not happy that this slimy frog thought that he had the right to sleep in her bed and to be her best friend all the time, and that he was going to tell her father that she was not happy about this situation. So I'm afraid she lost her temper. And she picked up that frog and she threw him against the wall as hard as she could. And she said, "Be quiet, you horrid frog." But when she threw him against the wall, something very strange happened. For when he hit the wall, he was a frog. But when he slid down and landed on the floor, it was no longer a frog that lay there, but a rather good-looking prince with very kind eyes. Well, the princess was very startled by this. But the young prince sat up and he said, "Thank you, princess. You have saved me from a wicked witch's spell. Please, could we go speak with your father? I need to talk to him." And so the princess got up and she put on her robe and she took the young prince to meet her father. And her father, the king, was very surprised to hear that there had been a prince enchanted as a frog living in his kingdom and very close to his castle. But he heard the whole story about how the wicked witch had gotten angry with the prince's family and had enchanted him to be a frog until a princess would take him to live in her house with her. And so the spell was broken. And the prince told the king that he was quite in love with the young princess. He had been watching her at the well for quite some time before he spoke to her, and that he would like to marry her. And the king said, "Well, I think that might be a good idea if you will let my daughter have a little bit more time to get to know you. But I suspect that your family is going to be very excited to hear that you are no longer a frog." And sure enough, and the king sent a message to the prince's family that he was no longer a frog. And a few days later, a carriage pulled up in front of the palace, a beautiful carriage with 8 white horses and golden harness on it. And behind the carriage was a young man named Henry. Now, he was the prince's faithful servant. He had been his servant for years. And Henry had been so upset when his master was taken and turned into a frog that they had thought his heart was going to break. And so they had taken 3 iron bands and wrapped them around his chest so that Henry's heart could not break. Henry was so happy to see the prince well again and human again. And so he jumped down off of the carriage and he opened the door and he helped the prince into the carriage and the princess into the carriage. And they were going to go to the prince's family so that he could see them again and show them that he was no longer a frog and that they could meet the princess who was going to be his wife. And once Henry had helped them into the carriage, he went around and he climbed up onto his seat on the back of the carriage. And as they began to drive off down the road, suddenly there was a loud cracking sound. And the prince said, Henry, I think the wheel of the carriage is breaking." And Henry said, "Oh no, your highness. It was one of the bands around my heart. It has broken because I am so relieved that you are not a frog anymore." And after they'd gone a little while longer, there was another cracking sound. And the prince said, "Henry, was that the wheel?" And Henry said, "Oh no, your highness. That was the second band around my heart. It has broken because I am so happy that you have come back to us." And then, a little while later, there was another cracking sound. And Henry didn't even wait for the prince to ask this time. This time he simply said, "Do not worry, your highness. That was only the 3rd band around my heart breaking, for I am so overjoyed that you have come back to us and that you are bringing such a lovely bride with you." And so the prince and the princess went back to his family, and they were married. And they lived very happily to the end of their days. And that is the story of the Frog Prince. We hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join us again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We'll have another story for you from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois, from somewhere around the world. We'll have another story for you. We'll see you later. Bye.